Welcome to welcome to Modern Aikido's podcast. It's great to have you back. We've had some great interviews and some great shows lately. I know the summer's been pretty hectic with me, so I apologize for some of my normal life duties getting in the way, but I want to get back into it. Um, Also, before we get started, I want to give my sincere thanks to those people who contributed to the PayPal tip jar and who have subscribed to the Spirit Aikido online program. Thank you very much. You help keep the show going. As you know, I'm very passionate about this, but your assistance and your feedback and your input and your support means a great deal to me. So thank you so much. In today's show, I want to get into talking about Aikido weapons. And I think it's a huge thing to talk about because for any number of reasons. One is it attracts students. People are fascinated with the Japanese sword. They like hearing that any martial art that they're thinking about studying includes the use of knives and how to protect yourself against somebody with a knife. Of course, the story about the Jo being the a sidearm or considered a weapon that the samurai carried when they legally could no longer carry swords lends to a certain mystique when in fact a Jo was really just a stick. Um, invite you to check out episode 177 of Modern Aikido's podcast, and I interviewed Ellis Amdur, who is a premier historian of jiu-jitsu, Aikido, Aikido, many Japanese arts. Just phenomenal knowledge. And the topic of our discussion was, did Aikido come from the Japanese battlefield? And I believe that this is one of those beliefs and reputations that Aikido has, that it came from that strong samurai battlefield art background. And what Ellis Amdur covered was in so much greater detail than I can recap here. I invite you to go look at that. But to give you the Reader's Digest version, no, it's not a one-to-one translation of armored samurai running around throwing techniques like we would do an empty hand. Was really not a battlefield thing. And just as you look at medieval battles of all kinds, hand-to-hand combat and wrestling and grappling was just not much of a thing. If you were on a battlefield, you were using the tools of warfare. And at the time, the samurai were primarily bowmen. A Japanese sword was a sidearm. It was not the main battle weapon. We talked a little about that in our episode. Spears were primary, bows were primary. There were pole arms and such, but to think of a sidearm being a primary weapon of a warrior was just not the case. So it's good to understand where these things fit. And for a number of reasons, I'm gonna break down today's show, and I'm gonna kind of split them up, and I'm gonna talk about each weapon specifically and some of the benefits and some of the problems that they have within the Aikido realm. And then I want to wrap it up with talking about how our art is viewed, how Aikido is viewed, how it markets itself, because its image and reputation has everything to do with attracting new students. And that's why I want to get into some of the issues and problems with how Aikido tends to treat its weaponry stuff, and how we can look at that and maybe come up with new ideas for how to improve our marketing and image, so that we can attract new students that've got the right frame of mind. So before we get totally into it, and I'm gonna start with the knife, but before I get into that, I want to cover Einstein's definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And this holds true whether it's doing physical technique, how we train, or even just our culture, how we look at weapons, how we look at the history of Aikido, or what we believe the history of Aikido to be, not necessarily the reality of it, but what we would like it to be, which is a romanticized vision. And in many cases, it is an image that has been carefully crafted that was not Morihei Ueshiba's or any of his contemporaries of what they viewed their martial art as being. It's something that came in long after the fact, that was crafted to create a specific image and message. And I would submit to you when I talk about these things, and I will try to point out how far the scope drift has been of Aikido's weapons work, and how it's drifted away from practical usage into more of a delusional or a fantasy realm, meant to, I guess, appeal to students, meant to give a sense of, I don't know, confidence or what have you. But unfortunately, that confidence is misplaced, and that's something we need to be very careful of in what we create an expectation within our students. We are doing the students a tremendous disservice if we give them a false sense of security when it comes to dealing with a deadly weapon. And I think that that's a moral obligation and a duty of those of us who are instructors, to create the correct viewpoint to facing or dealing with a dangerous and deadly weapon. There are some good things about how Aikido approaches weapons. When I say some, I wouldn't say that it's a majority, but there is some useful aspects to the weapons training, at least that I experienced and I've seen other people experience. And that includes from different organizations, different schools, seminars, what have you, all of it. There are some morsels of good things in there. But what I want to cover is the unfortunate part of the glaring holes that exist in there. And these holes are sometimes so bad that they could get somebody killed. If they have confidence in something that is missing key fundamentals, you don't have a great lot of room for error when you come to dealing with a deadly weapon. You just don't. And that level of importance is something that any weapons work, I think, needs to have. I will also say, before we get started into the particular weapons, that what Aikido does with weapons, I think, creates more problems than it does solutions, both to the image of what Aikido is and just the practicality part. And while I think our duty to students about the practicality is very, very important, I think it's evident in the last 20, 30 years how the inattention to the image and reputation that's created by how we teach these things and how we convey them and how we try to justify them and explain them to the average world is a big problem. And I think it's created a much bigger problem for Aikido in general, in how it's perceived and the reputation that it's garnered, which, let's be honest, it sucks. It's bad. It's really bad. And that brings me to the first part, and that is the knife, or the tanto. I will say that the tanto has been, and the knife work that I was taught and liked, was my first crisis of faith with Aikido. And it came much like many other Aikidoka who have shared their same experience and viewpoint. They say, when you talk about knife work and Aikido, they just shake their head like, yeah, it sucks. And they don't want to say it. They don't want to come across as being, a hater. And I don't either. I want to see this problem addressed and fixed. And kind of like an alcoholic, you can only fix it if you acknowledge that there's a problem first. If you can't admit there's a problem, you don't think there's a problem, and you're not going to fix it. It's not going to get addressed. And I'm really glad to see in the last, 8 to 10 years, there have been a number of very respected instructors that have openly admitted, like, this knife stuff has got to change. We cannot keep doing this. The collaborations, such as with Josh Gold and Jeff Imada, bring in people that deal with knives to highlight the problems, and let's fix them. I think that things like these are going to be the effective way forward for Aikido. And if it doesn't do them, and some people won't, so there's going to be a large part of the Aikido community that's just never going to address any of these things. And that's fine. But if there's enough of us that do, we are the chance that Aikido is going to have that at least people will start to understand, okay, well, there's a couple of different viewpoints within Aikido, and the ones that will gain a respect are the ones who attach themselves to reality and want to drift that direction, to say, let's get real with this. And that's my intention here. It's not to be a hater, and not to try to create division within the art, or within any community. But I think it's important to address the reality part. And there, like I said earlier, with the knife work, there are some applicable principles. I like how, at least the stuff that I was taught about how to, once you've got a hold of a wrist or you've got a control of the arm, and maybe you set somebody down, you strip a knife. I like that. There are a couple of drills that I felt were worth keeping, as I totally overhauled my own knife curriculum in my school. So it's not like you need to throw absolutely 100% of everything out. However, the stuff that's there really needs work. And if you don't think so, and I know I've mentioned this on previous podcasts, do the marker drill. Take somebody, anybody from age 10 on up, or 9 even, and give them just a marker. And you put on a white shirt and you say, you will do everything you can to mark up this, basically to cut me, and don't let me take that marker out of your hand. And I'll even give you $50, if you can mark up my shirt, or and keep me from getting a hold of it. And don't tell them how to attack. Tell them you can attack any way you want. You can go as fast as you want. The whole thing's up to you. Go. And I'll tell this story. The first time I did this, and this would have been, about 12, 15 years ago now. I had a friend of mine come up, and he was a Kung Fu instructor, but he had a very strong real world violence as part of his profession experience. He worked in, bar closer, bar security, the whole 9 yards. He was what I consider the real deal. And he brought this drill up, and, he said, and this is the thing, you don't need any training to mark somebody up really bad. Don't think for a second that somebody has to be a trained knife fighter to be a challenge with a knife. And that's why as soon as you give an instruction to, you can get 10 seconds of instruction to somebody, like, you just, as fast as you can, I want you to carve me up. And we did this, and we did it at a seminar that I hosted at my dojo. And I had other martial art friends. I've got a friend of mine who's a scream instructor that's been teaching much longer than I have. And, his martial art deals with knives specifically. Like, that is one of their primary focuses, not only attacking with a knife, but also disarming. So I thought, I really want to check this out, because if anybody's going to be able to come away with a clean shirt, it's going to be him and his senior students, right? And so we all get white shirted up, and we go through this marker drill, and every single one of us, and we had probably 12 people in that room. Every single one had marks on their neck, head, hands, forearms. We just used t-shirts. So we had marks on our forearms, marks on the shirt, front, back, up, down, left, right, all over the place. And nobody got a disarm out of that entire exercise. And each one of our exchanges would go about a minute, minute and a half. And we all would have been dead if it was actually a real knife. And we were dealing with markers. So the blade was about not even an inch long. Imagine if that blade was 4 or 5 inches. It would have been, all would have been dead. And so, great learning opportunity, and reality check is what it is. To drive home, everybody can learn something, no matter how much how many hours you've spent in a dojo going over your patterns or going over the principles and things like that. You need to understand where you really stand with things. Do not have a false sense of security when you're facing a deadly weapon. And to be honest with you, I think I would rather face a handgun than a knife in a live confrontation. Knives are underappreciated for how dangerous they really are. So I wanted to talk a little bit, because I mentioned earlier about some of the stuff that I kept with my curriculum. And one of the ones that I did like was it's a range drill, where you have somebody that's coming at you, slashing very quickly, and you're trying to stay just out of range, and then figure out how to time your entry so that you don't get cut, but you need to close that distance. I like that drill because it really hones up your footwork and your timing and your estimation of range. I'll tell every student, if somebody pulls out a knife and you're facing one, you better get a bigger weapon, and you better get away from him until you find a bigger weapon. And that can be a chair, it can be a stick, it can be, garbage can, anything that you can put between you and that knife to keep it from getting into you. And this is something that I see just glazed over in almost all knife training stuff, is what is the first thing you should look for. And improvised weapons are, in my opinion, at the top of my list. Yes, you want to get out of there, but being chased by a guy with a knife isn't that much better than facing him straight up. So, if you can get distance, absolutely do it. But if you can get something in your hands that's big that you can use as a shield or barrier, and then you can start hitting them with it, that's really the way to go. Now, sometimes you can't. We all have to train for the what if your optimal does not happen. You can't get away. You can't create distance, and you don't have a weapon. You don't have anything improvised. You can't even roll up a jacket to keep yourself from getting slashed. Then what? Okay, fair enough. We need to cover that base, right? And there's some very good material out there. One of my favorites is Mark Denny, who is one of the founders of the Dog Brothers Martial Arts. He did a great seminar that I saw via video years ago called Die Less Often. And he comes from a pretty strong Eskrima background, if I remember right, Filipino martial arts. And his attitude through the whole thing, I think, was spot on. It's chances are, if the knife comes out, you're probably gonna get cut, if not worse, i.e. injured severely or possibly killed. But there are some good fundamentals that you can use to improve your odds, and that's all it does, is improve your odds. And a lot of these are fundamentals that we teach, right, in Aikido. Not just get off the line, but you need to close and use your footwork. You need to jam the weapon. They had a lot of stuff that they talked about. I'm not going to go into all of his material, but it's really good stuff. There are things you can do to improve your odds, but I think at the end of the day, in your mind, it has to be, you understand, all I'm doing is improving my odds. I could still lose this. So with that, one of the people that I trained with and still do is now a former professional law enforcement officer. And we were training one day with a few of my students and myself, and one of them asked him, they said, have you ever faced a knife for real? And he said, yeah, about 7, 8, 9 times, something like that. And he said this, but it never looked like how it looks in a dojo, where somebody's holding a knife out in front of them, and it's like Errol Flynn with a rapier, and he's pointing it at you, and you have to then. He said, didn't look anything like that. He said, in every single case, firstly, in every single case, I never got cut. Nobody ever got injured. And that knife never fully made it out. And to me, once he described this sounded like the Shoto Seizu, the controlled first move. He said, in every single instance, I saw somebody reach for their belt, and I slid in and controlled that arm. And before the knife could come out or be deployed, I had control of their body, or at least enough of it that knife wasn't going to get taken out. Never got drawn. Now, ask yourself, how many times have you been taught how to spot somebody drawing a weapon, how to deal with it, how to position yourself under like what's beginning to be a tense situation so that you can see the weapon draw? How many times have you worked on exercises to be looking at the hands, watching for a hand that's maybe hidden behind their leg that you can't see, and what to do about that? These are things that are integral to professionals that work with, in realms that have, I guess, the seedier side of humanity. Bouncers, bar personnel, security guards, security officers, law enforcement, all this kind of stuff. They know that it doesn't look like Hollywood violence when somebody's holding a knife out in front of you, or holding it to your face or what have you. If you've gotten to that point, your skills have failed in a major way. Those skills are what I'm the most intrigued with in helping build in my students, so that if you see somebody going for a belt, do not wait for a weapon to be drawn and deployed on you and then figure out how you're going to defend yourself. That is a bad strategy. So I felt his answer was very interesting. And he also said it wasn't that hard to take control of somebody because one of their hands is already busy. And in fact, they're not even thinking about moving. Their footwork freezes because everything that's in their mind is grab that weapon. And I remember hearing, this was I guess a Bruce Lee statement way back in the day. I don't know if this was an interview or not, but he said that he actually liked facing somebody with a weapon because it meant that mentally, that's the only thing they were thinking about, is how do I hit with this weapon? They weren't thinking of punching with the other hand. They weren't thinking of kicking. They aren't thinking of throwing. They aren't thinking of grappling. All they're thinking about, their focus is so intent on using that weapon that it narrows down their options. And he liked that. He liked only having to deal with a few potential options. Now, of course, the guy was crazy fast, which, as somebody who's older and not nearly as fast as Bruce Lee, and I'm not even in the same category, I would be concerned about not having, blazing speed on my side when a knife gets pulled out. So, think about that, and think, if you are an instructor or you're leading a practice group, or you even want to do your own practice group, think about, all right, let's start before the brandish of the weapon happens. What's happening? And this is another thing that I've gotten from a number of law enforcement officers. They'll often say, when fights happen out in the real world, a lot of times people that start fights are armed, and often with knives, but they can be with a firearm or some other kind of a weapon. And it could be a, battery in a sock, or who knows what. They said usually it won't start with the weapon. The weapon comes out when the person who started the fight is losing. They thought they could win the fight just with, bare hand shoving, intimidation, all of that stuff. And it is not working anymore. And now they need to step it up. And that's when the weapon comes out. So this is one of those things where, even if somebody does start to face you with empty hands, do not assume that they are unarmed because they didn't pull a weapon out right away. They could have one hidden. They could have several hidden. You just don't know. So I would say that the knife, the way that Aikido does the knife with a lot of its disarms, is just, it doesn't give us a good look, because there's more and more, and I really appreciate in the last 20, 30 years, there seems to be more focus and attention and interest in realism in martial arts, and not just I want to be a fantasy, kind of fighter. I want a black belt. I want to have the outfit and all that other stuff. And I think that's a good thing. I think that moving towards understanding reality is going to have fewer instances of people hurt because they think they're good with their hands or good against weapons. My wife, for example, in high school, she had a friend of hers that was a black belt in Taekwondo, and he got into a fight and stabbed and killed with a screwdriver. And, I don't know nobody knows really the details because it happened out of view. But he was a nice kid. He was not one of those kids that goes around starting fights. It's not really known whether whoever picked a fight with him thought, well, hey, Mr. Black Belt, how good are you at defending yourself? Let's see you. Maybe that happened. Who knows? But at the end of the day, this young man was killed because he was not prepared. Now, and I'm not even going to say that Taekwondo should have prepared him for a knife attack. I know that from the Taekwondo I've seen, they don't do a lot of that. But the fact is, knives, even a screwdriver, is very, very dangerous. That has to be taken seriously. So, I don't think that a school needs to go full into, a heavy duty combatives Krav Maga level of kill something, when a knife comes out and start getting into that zone. However, when even if you take out wooden knives to practice, there should be an intensity of, this matters now. My life is on the line, and you have to take that seriously. So one of the things that I do like, and I did integrate into my program, was if somebody holds a knife to you, such as holds it against your throat, they hold it to your belly, and they're like, all right, give me your money, that sort of thing. These things do kind of happen, but it's important to have the fundamentals in place of what your reflex is.
And it's not that you're gambling on fast reflexes. You need a level of distraction, misdirection. You need to be able to read somebody when they're ready to actually twitch and cut your throat, versus when you've caught them in a moment where they know they have the upper hand. They're not just ready to kill you instantly, and you're like, I'll give you what you want. Then you start. That's when the manipulation part starts, and some of this I got from my sport background, where you are trying to lull somebody into a point where they're not ready for you to move, and that's when you move. You need to have that buffer of attention where you can take a decisive motion to end this direct threat to you, and do it as safely as possible, with the least chance of you getting cut or stabbed. So there's a lot that you can do with it, and I'm not saying that there's any one doctrine of knife, uh, of knife martial art, or a knife approach that prevails over all of them. They all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses, they all have their benefits. In my opinion, they all have their problems. Um, the idea that you need to be a trained knife fighter in order to, if you want to attack somebody and hurt them with a knife is such a great tool. You don't need a lot of training to hurt somebody and kill, or even kill somebody with a knife. And if you do have a 10 or 11-year-old and you want to do that marker drill, you tell them, hey, you play keep away. Do not, don't let me grab you, and I'll give you a gallon of ice cream if you can mark up this shirt. And I guarantee you, even as an adult, you will have your hands full and you will going to get marked up. So don't think that because somebody is younger, smaller, appears to be weaker, you put that knife in their hand, and that is a great equalizer. So be warned. I think that improving and readdressing how Aikido deals with knife training is probably the fundamental building block of addressing the reality part. And if we came across as being serious about doing that, the reputation of Aikido would change rather quickly. Especially to say, what, we've made a mistake. Like, this has gone way too far. We're gonna clean up. We're gonna clean up the business here and do this correctly. It's less about exactly what you do, but having the intention to say, what, we're gonna focus on this, or we're gonna make this a priority. Now, onto the sword. The sword is a really tricky business with Aikido. And I think that, unlike the knife, the sword really is the image of the samurai. It is the soul, right, of the samurai, was the katana. And the attachment that Aikido has to the sword, and I would trace this right back to Morihei Ueshiba. He wanted to basically look like a samurai. He liked having the bokken, doing the bokken work, and it's all kinds of pictures of him swinging the sword around and doing all kinds of stuff with the bokken. And he never really talks about why, or at least as far as I know, it doesn't go into depth about why the sword was so important. But it has come to be that contemporary Aikido, from at least the 60s on, probably before that, has a very close tie to the Japanese sword. And I think there's that, you can't even dispute that. It's on so many images, and the silhouettes and stuff you see of a person in hakama with a sword, the whole thing. Kind of the problem with that is that Morihei really didn't go into get any extensive training in any sword disciplines or any sword school. He did get a background in bayonet through the military, and he apparently was extraordinarily talented at it. The issue is that with traditional, and I'll say legit, Japanese sword schools, or Ruha, that they have almost all come to say that what they see of Aikiken or Morihei's sword work is highly dubious. In fact, they go so far as to say they have bad fundamentals. They show very bad sword fundamentals. Now, I think a great deal of gravity should be given to Kendoists, Iaido people, kenjutsu, like the people that are doing sword as their primary thing, including being in competition, like live work against another swordsman. Listen to these people. They know something about what they're talking about, and that's why I I feel like the way that Aikido deals with the sword should should be overhauled. And I know that there have been many instructors. Kenji Tomiki, I think Nishio had Shihan had a background in Japanese sword, and they brought that into their Aikido. But that was not a universal practice. That was within their school, within their art, and it's great for Aikido instructors who have a background in those other arts to bring in those fundamentals. But at some point, do they have a dilemma? All right, well, this is what Aikido teaches, and I'm supposed to be teaching this, but what I learned in the actual sword art is that. When do I throw this out to replace it with that? And that's an understandable dilemma, and one that really I think that each one will have to deal with. But if we keep the contemporary or Aikido made up Ken work, then we're really doing a disservice to the legit sword arts that know what they're talking about. And whether we do it or do not do it with a sword is, I think, also fairly minor. But what I would be looking for is what is the attitude and why. If Aikido is gonna stick with what it's always done, which is not very relevant, not based on anything that's been tested through pressure or anything like that, then that tells me a great deal about the spirit of the contemporary Aikido. It tells me that we're not really interested in reality. Thanks. We're just going to keep doing our little fantasy thing over here that we've always liked doing. And that's where I come back to Einstein's statement about the definition of insanity. If you keep doing the same thing and you expect to get different results, i.e., having a better reputation, having, at least some respect from people outside of Aikido saying, yeah, I think what they're doing is a good thing, versus, well, they're kind of delusional over there in the Aikido planet. Just my opinion. But I think the sword work is really, it's a big part of creating Aikido as appearing like a cosplay art, which is to dress up like samurai, pretend, and kind of feed on the Japanese culture thing, which, okay, the Japanese culture is kind of cool. I get that. There's aspects of it I really respect. But to just dress up in costumes and pretend you're a samurai, that's not really a martial art. And I would say that, even now in the last 5-10 years, I've seen, there are martial arts schools that just teach Hollywood movie martial arts. They mix in the heavy wushu Chinese, very dramatic, acrobatic, stunt style martial arts, and they teach that. And they say, well, this is not for any practical use of, unless you want to become a stuntman or a movie star or something like that. It's got its own niche. But, is that a similar niche to what Aikido is drifting into or has drifted into? I think that's an important question. Now, with sword disarms, and if you thought I had a problem with knife disarms, the sword disarms are probably 5 to 10 times worse in Aikido than they are with the knife. And in a previous interview, and this is episode 123 with Bruce, I had Bruce Bookman and Ellis Amdur, and we were talking about kind of the history of Aikido, and it was fascinating discussion. And in there, Ellis came up with a great story, and I'd heard a portion of it before, but he went into a little bit more detail. And that is, and this was, I think, back in the 50s or 60s, somewhere like that. And there was a pretty senior instructor, and he was sitting amongst a number of fellow Aikido instructors, and I think from the Aikikai, if I'm not mistaken. And they were doing, as with in the All Japan demonstration, they're doing, full on day, full day of demonstrations, and they were coming out and they were showing sword disarms, and I wish I could remember his name. I'm not good at remembering Japanese names, unfortunately, but he leans over and he says, "We really need to stop doing this. Like, this is just, there are legit Japanese swordsmen in this room, senior instructors. There's a lot of them. So what we are showing is disrespectful to their art because they know what nonsense this is. And if you think, firstly, go give the marker drill a try with just a marker to imitate a knife. Now imagine a 3-foot knife and give it to somebody who's a complete spaz, who's just waving the thing around, and you try to disarm that thing. You are going to get carved up, like sushi. And that's just, I think the sword is one of the most dangerous weapons, out there. And, against somebody who's unarmed, it's just a turkey shoot. And then to assume that you can just walk in and take the thing away. Well, if you look at it, the way, and to be fair, I love doing and playing with Aikido's sword disarms. They're a ton of fun. But I also realize in order to succeed with them, you have to have your uke do very prescribed, strictly adhered to choreography that you can work with. If they go off script, you're done. You are just totally done. And this is, I think, a major danger. It's also a major danger with the knife. But in doing them, and yes, within those disarms, both sword and knife, there are some good fundamentals. There's some good footwork. There's some good range control. There's some good angle cutting, good, offline movement and stuff. But the minute you are having people go through this scenario, it builds in their subconscious mind the idea that, yeah, I could do this. This is really plausible. They overlook all the variables that get turned off in order to make that work. And that's the dangerous part. So they're fun, they're entertaining, but if anybody gets lured into thinking that they're real or practical, that's very dangerous, and they're almost suicidal by doing it. And that's something we as instructors cannot imprint on our students. That would be our fault. So view them as entertainment, but not practical in terms of an art. So now there are different interpretations of how swords can be used or fought with. Some are legit, some are not. But in order to really prove them, it has to be done under pressure. And that is not having prescribed, katas, even paired katas, which are closer than doing solo katas. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But you need to have live work, live range control. And almost everything I've seen done with the Japanese sword and the Jo is done well outside of a range where either could actually touch each other with the weapon. They're doing Hollywood martial arts where they're just smacking the swords together for dramatic effect. And it's fun, yeah. But if you really need to understand true range, not just Hollywood range, then you need a study that's going to include those disciplines and to imprint those fundamentals on somebody. That just is what it is. So last one I want to get to is the Jo, and I've got mixed feelings on this one because I do find that the Jo can be a very good analytical tool for troubleshooting empty hand technique. It's much harder to do the Jo versions of empty hand technique. And when you have a student go through those, you'll start seeing what the problems are with their normal empty hand technique. But that has nothing to do with the Jo being an actual practical weapon. Zero. There's also one big difference from the Jo than from the knife or the bokken, or the tanto and the bokken, and that is that the Jo is not trying to represent something else. A wooden sword is trying to emulate a metal blade, same way a wooden tanto is trying to emulate a steel knife. A Jo is just a stick. It's the same stick that you'd have if you were really hitting somebody with it as if you're, practicing in the dojo. And this also brings up kind of one of the issues I have with, the idea of a thrust. And that is, if you're going to thrust somebody with a blunt-ended dowel, you're probably not going to do much damage unless you hit them in the eye or in the mouth or something like that. But if you bonk them on the forehead or stab them in the chest, it's just going to be a strong poke, and that's it. Now, if you put a sharp tip on it, now you're talking a spear. You poke somebody with that, they're in big trouble. Like, because I think the spear is probably the most of all of the casualties ever caused in warfare throughout or combat throughout the history of mankind. I'm convinced that the spear is probably killed more than anybody, followed probably by the knife. But how would you ever tell, get numbers on that? But the spear is a primary weapon, and this is why it was a primary war weapon throughout all of human history in virtually every culture on the face of the planet. I want to stab somebody, and I want them to be way over there, so I want a really long stick, and I want to be safe, but I'm going to try to stab them. Romans had it. The era even pre-Roman, the spears. Anybody that had a piece of wood would put a tip on it, sharpen it, and there you go. It's a spear. So the issue too that I have with a lot of our Joe work is, like with the thrust, yes, you can practice being able to hit hard with a thrust, but almost nobody ever does. They don't hit a pel or hit some kind of a static target to feel what it's like to drive force through that tip and get the feedback of whatever it is you're hitting. Likewise, it takes some skill to hit somebody hard enough, with the haft, like you're swinging it at them as opposed to thrusting. It takes some skill to hit hard enough to actually affect somebody, at least somebody who's adrenalized into a fighting state. Yeah, you can hit them and it will probably hurt a little bit, but it probably won't stop them unless you really know how to hit hard. Again, when we do a lot of kata in the empty air, you're not really getting much practice with that. It just is what it is. Much less, you're not even looking at a target to start to train yourself for range control. And if there's one thing that you could argue is the most important thing for any warrior fighter to have, is understanding range, being able to see and estimate how close somebody is and whether you're in range or out of range or just at the edge of range, or how, that takes looking at an actual target, not just waving your stick around in the air against nothing. So here's where I've also run into this claim numerous times, that the Jo in Aikido, it's not meant to teach somebody how to fight with a stick. It's not meant to teach somebody how to, defend themselves, what have you, with a stick. To what my answer is, then what exactly is it for? If you're waving a stick around like you're hitting somebody, like you're trying to poke them, thrust at them, then what are you doing with it? It looks like you're fighting. It gives the people that you are training the impression that they are learning about stick fighting, when in fact they are not. And that's really the core issue. It's what is the expectation? If you take your Jo out there and you use it like a lever to, lift up heavy objects, well, you're using it like a lever. It can be used for that, but you're actually creating leverage. Archimedes would be proud, right? Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum, and I'll move the world. But to dress up like a warrior, to swing a Jo around or any weapon around as though you are actually hitting somebody with it, potentially harming them, that paints a very clear picture in somebody's mind. If that's not the picture you want to paint, then don't do those activities. Don't lure somebody into thinking those while they are getting what is incomplete training and missing crucial fundamentals to what that training would be. Even if you're honest with them and say, you know what, this is not for stick fighting. Oh, but by the way, now we're going to swing at each other and you got to block, and just put two and two together. Anybody with common sense would go, okay, you just said we're not fighting, and now you're having us pretend we're fighting. Right? That's the image. So define what it's for. Now, you could also say, well, if it's not for stick fighting, then is it used for against somebody who's disarmed, who's not armed? They're empty-handed. They don't have it. So are we going to be now training to attack somebody with a weapon when they don't have a weapon. I think anybody, normal person would say, no, we're not going to train to do that. That would be ridiculous. So defining what you want it to do, what it should be doing, and the correct impression you want to create on your students and potential students that are going to come in and look, well, what are you doing with, when you talk about weapons, and so many people come into dojos, they're like, okay, well, tell me about what you do for weapons. What sort of training do you have for weapons? What is your approach? That has to be a good, clear answer. We don't have the benefit of, like it was in the 70s where you can kind of make up anything you want. Even the early 80s was still like this of, wow, we'll teach you to do this, that, and the other. And you're making a promise now. If you promise to get somebody skill in the stick, you better deliver on it, or you will get a bad reputation. Like, that's just, whether it's a bad reputation for you as the instructor, your school, or the art that you teach. And I think you could make an argument that all of those are included. Every single one of us that wears this, Aikido name or claims to be part of Aikido, we are ambassadors of our art. We have to take that seriously, and we have to follow through on our promises when we say, we will teach you to be competent with, whether you call it a sword, bokken, knife, stick, whatever. You better take that promise seriously, or, the reputation will follow. Then there comes into the Jodori, which are the Jo disarms. And I'd say the same thing about the marker drill. Give somebody a Jo, and this one I'd say avoid the 10-year-old. Get somebody roughly your size and say, all right, can you hit me with that thing? I'm going to try to take it away from you, and stop me from taking it away from you. And I want you to see if it looks anything like what a Jodori technique would look like, or even that you're able to effectively do it reliably, not just once, but I'm talking, you do this for 5-10 minutes, you should be able to come away with the Jo easily, or fairly easily, without getting hit most of the time. Give that a shot and see how that works out for you. I would be willing to bet that there's at least an 85 to 90% failure rate on that. And the failure would be either you get hit, or you wind up in a tug of war with the Jo and you can't get it out of somebody's arms, right? If it's a Jo disarm, then that's the ultimate goal, right? So give that one a try. I will say that Jo disarms, I pretty much gave up on them for that very reason. They just don't hold up. Like I said before, though, the one thing I found great value with was using the Jo to troubleshoot footwork and connection. And these are when Uke grabs the Jo and then you do technique like a Shionage or a Kotegashi or a Nikyo or what have you, or an Ikkyo with the Jo. But it really is only a troubleshooting thing for me, because you have to set up the parameters by having Uke grab in a particular way. You're kind of removing their ability to improvise or keep fighting back. That almost destroys the troubleshooting part of studying Nage's movement, range control, the internal stuff. So I do find value that's there. The history part of the Jo being a replacement weapon for when the samurai couldn't carry swords was true. But I would say that in modern day, there are hiking sticks. We here in the United States at least call them hiking sticks or walking sticks, I think. They're longer, and you can actually use those and walk around with. The one thing that I find interesting from history is that in historical Japan, such sticks were ubiquitous. Like, you could walk around and it would not even be, no one would give it a second thought or second look. Here in the US, and I think in most of the Western world, if you walked into an airport with a hiking stick, they'd probably say, well, you can't walk onto the plane with that. You can't. But what is ubiquitous in the Western world today? To me, that's the cane. And that's sometimes called a walking stick too. But you walk anywhere with a cane, there's so many people with knee problems, hip problems, back problems. It doesn't matter if you look physically fit and you're not hobbling. Walking with a cane you can go anywhere with it. And in my opinion, if we're looking at how do we adapt to modern times, using and training in the walking stick or the cane, I think is probably the best bang for your buck. And that can also be one of those unbreakable umbrellas Works the same. It's about a 3-foot stick. Again, you walk just about everywhere with them. Of course, it might look a little conspicuous if you've got, really sunny, gorgeous weather out all the time and you're walking around with an umbrella. But that said, Aikido doesn't need to fit into the mold of what was life like in Japan in the late 1800s. They fit what their modern day was, and they made their weapon work fit into that. And I think it was also not just a coincidence that Ueshiba's specialty being the bayonet, the Jo is a pretty good replacement for it, which is similar to a spear. Bayonet techniques are related to spear techniques. But that doesn't fit as well in modern world. And this is something that I observed about the Okinawan weapons work, the kobudo. For that point in history in Okinawa, the Okinawans were restricted from having any kind of weaponry. So they used farm implements, which can be used to good effect as a weapon, but they weren't really designed for that. And they developed this whole martial art around using farm implements, which exists to this day. And which is, I guess, a respect for the history. But how much of us, if we wanted to actually carry a weapon, would go down to the farm store and start shopping for farm implements to carry around to protect ourselves with, right? Why not adapt our Aikido to our modern world using the principles and fundamentals rather than a world that existed 150 years ago or 80 years ago or whenever. Just something to think about. There's two things with the sword and the Jo that they have in common. And for this, I'll share a little story. Back when I was, the weapon art that I was doing was primarily medieval weapons. So swords, spears, pole arms, great swords, two-handed swords, shields, the whole 9 yards, maces, all of it. And my favorite for the longest time was a pole arm. So it was about 6 feet, and it had a blade of about 2 feet, 2.5 feet on the end. And that was a great weapon for me. Loved it. Very competitive with it. Without blowing my own horn, I was quite good at it. And I was always on the hunt for more information. I wanted to get more sources, more ideas. What could I improve on? And one of the hunts that I went on was the quarterstaff. And there were sometimes instructors that would host little quarterstaff workshops or classes, and I'd always go way out of my way to go attend them because I wanted, like, what have you got that I could use or that I could improve my own martial art with? And I after about a dozen of these things through different venues, then came YouTube, and I watched videos and the whole thing. Went after it, for an extended period of time. The conclusion I came to is that they were mostly all just doing flourishing. There wasn't really any part of their teaching that covered dealing with a live opponent, overcoming a defense, actually striking something or somebody. Now, granted, if you're not in armor, you don't want to be hitting, braining people with a stick. But almost all of these classes were how to spin it around and flourish it and do strikes in the air. And Aikido's sword and Jo are exactly like this. They do a lot of stuff with no opponent, very little paired kata, if even. And I'll give the what is the name of it? I'm blanking on the name of it. I'll come up with it here in a second. But it's a Japanese art, very old art that deals with sword, naginata, spear, and they do almost all paired kata. Katori Shinto-ryu, that's the one. And that gets much closer away from the flourishing into actually dealing with a live attacker than just waving the thing around. And it's fun when you can learn to spin a quarter staff, or you can spin it over your head or switch hands and kind of go all, what was the guy, Ray Park, the guy that played Darth Maul. And I guess his story was that he was out in a park and he was just doing this flourishing and he looked freaking great. And they we got to get you in the movies, buddy. And they hired him and kind of took off after that. But again, real martial art or Hollywood? If you're not actually working with a live opponent, trying to overcome their defense and trying to, then you're just flourishing. Then you're in the cosplay zone. or are closer than that than I personally would be interested in. Or that you want to build in your students thinking, okay, this is actually a real legit martial art. This is for, using a weapon if you needed it to defend yourself. And I think that's a careful moral line to be wary of. But the marketing is there's something to be said for that. And that is just like with Ray Park that he was outdoors doing his flourishing thing, he attracted people. In this case, he attracted, movie executives or, movie professionals, but I'm sure he attracted kids and all kinds of people were watching like, wow, look at that guy. I'm sure he had a crowd around him almost all the time. And there's something to be said for that. The question is, do we want to court that kind of approach? Does Aikido want to stray into that zone or stay in that zone if we're there now? Is that what Aikido is about currently? And do we want to stay there, or do we want to offer more practical realism that's less into the play kind of zone? And I think the best argument to be made for attracting new students by doing something interesting and fun like that is an art that I was exposed to years ago in my old dojo under my old previous instructor. We had this very charming, personable young man come in, and he was starting off a Haidong Gumdo dojo here in the cities. And we agreed to let him come in and do a little seminar, and gathered up, a bunch of people, and he showed this art. And for those of you who don't know, at least this is how it was explained to me, that Haidong Gumdo is a traditional Korean art that focuses on sword work, almost entirely sword. And that not many people, this is what I was told, not many people know, but the Koreans also had a curved sword, almost the exact same dimensions as a katana. They also wore hakama, or some kind of hakama, and that this was kind of only recently rediscovered, that this art was rediscovered, having been lost for some time. Now, when you look at a practitioner of Haidong Gumdo, they wear Japanese hakama. They use the same bokken that Japanese sword arts use, which I always thought was curious. I know a little something about medieval weaponry, and I'd never heard of any curved, very katana-like sword coming out of Korea. I'm like, okay, whatever. A lot of stuff I don't know. And then, he basically showed a solid portion of their curriculum, which is sword drawing. So basically Iaido, cuts and katas, kata patterned with cuts and blocks and deflections and dodges and footwork. It was a rather spectacular show. Great display of athletics, of balance, of coordination, all good stuff. And it looked great. It's in the hakama, it's got the nice gi on. And I found out later that there's quite a bit of dubious, their claims are rather dubious about having a solid historical connection. But what I saw in the marketing was that kids and teenagers were drawn to it like bees to honey. They loved it. They loved the outfits. They loved the physical work. They liked learning the patterns and the katas. They liked, waving a sword around. And to me, I saw the brilliance. The brilliance was, and we all know this, if you want to make money in martial arts, you go after the kids. They're the ones that pay, that pay the rent and keep dojos alive. And you come up with something interesting and fun for them to do, and you will get students. That's just the reality of it. And then I realized too that Korea has for a long time been the king of marketing martial arts. And the success of Taekwondo across the country, at least across the country, if not probably across the world, has been second to none. And what I had heard more than a decade or 2 decades ago was that if you go to college in Korea, you can get a bachelor's degree in martial arts. And that's not just teaching you the physical side of the art, like how to be an instructor, how to know, know your physical art and then how to teach it. They'll also teach you how to set up a business. They'll teach you how to open your own dojo. They'll teach you how to market your art. They got a whole, solid 4-year college curriculum in the business of running a martial art dojo and essentially being the face of Korean martial arts. And they've done this to success. They've got it down. It's this is why strip malls are filled with Taekwondo dojos, because they've figured out how to make money and they're doing it. And to their credit, and if that sounds critical or negative, it's not meant to be. I love that kids are out doing physical things. They're learning about the physical culture. They're dealing with, training with one another face to face. Learning. It's a great environment, or rather, it can be. I know there's some that are not so good, but that's what kids should be doing, not sitting and watching, an iPad, not sitting glaring in front of a TV for 10 hours a day. That's just my personal little rant. I'll just jump off that now. But physical culture is very important for our kids. But the idea that an art was crafted and made to serve a specific purpose and to fill, a market niche, because Taekwondo didn't do any weapons. So now what? If you realize that weapons attract students, why not create an art that attracts students that want to learn weapons, and then find out a fun, safe, engaging way for them to do it, and then charge them money for it? I think that's brilliant, actually. But claiming that you have a historical lineage when it can't really be proven very well, or is under, a rather rigorous amount of dispute, that brings in kind of an ethical question. But, all is good for them, I suppose, and bless them for doing it. And if the kids benefit, then, I'm all for it. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what each of us are comfortable doing ourselves. How do we want to approach this? And, the last discussion I had with Tengu, this was a big subject for us of, okay, how do each one of us go forward? What we can't do is sit around and wait for a top-down dictate to say, here's how, here's Aikido's new direction, and here's how we're all going to go together. Because we know that's not going to happen. The message is not going to come. And even if the message did come, how would it be received? It just would not be a universal, okay, we're all going to change. Any change that we introduce is going to have to come from each one of us individually. And that might be, those of us who lead a dojo or who lead students to say, here's what I think, this makes more sense to me than what we've been doing now for decades. What do you guys think? What do you think we should do? Or, here's what I'd like to do. What do you guys think about it? And I know a lot of you will probably reel at the idea of, well, I'm the dojo cho, I'm the chief instructor, I'm not asking my students anything, I'm the one running the game. Well, if that's the case, cool. Then you alone will have to do the introspection and the decision making to think about, all right, what am I going to do going forward with this, and implement it, and then follow through and do it. Absolutely on board with that. I will say that in my case, as I was going along with my senior students and even my intermediate students, I would get them together and say, here's my thought. Let me run this by you. Here's what we've been doing. Here's what I kind of have an issue with. And here's how I think it would be better to do it. And this is what I want to try. I can't remember one time when I had even one student say, I'd rather do it the old way, or the idea that you came up with, I don't think is very good. At very least, it was, it's worth trying. Let's give it a shot. Let's see how it goes. And I don't recall ever one having been, whoa, we really screwed up on that one. We should go back to what we were doing before. Maybe what we tried out needed a little bit of tweaking, and we tweaked it and improved it. But in every case, we came out much better. Students were having fun. In fact, they almost every time we did this, they had more fun, because the exercises and drills and the lessons that I crafted were designed to be engaging, fun, not just boring or rote memorization. They were meant to be tactile, live, bridging in with good fundamentals. And that, I got a lot of great feedback for that. So if you're hesitating, certainly give it some thought before you pull a trigger on anything, but give some thought to improving your art, the way that you like to train it, the way that you like to teach it, the fundamentals that you think are important. And if there are fundamentals that you find are missing, figure out how to build them, how to put them in, whether that's bringing, another instructor in or another, experienced person to give you some tips or pointers. I've done that for a number of instructors, and I view we instructors and seniors as being a peer group. We are there to help each other. We're not there to, lord over our skill or experience over others. We are all there to help each other up. It's that rising tide raises all the boats theory. Or if you just say, there's something about the way that we've taught this has always kind of bugged me. And that could be, I teach this and none of my students really pick up on it, or very few of them do, and it takes me a while to get through this. That feedback should be an invitation for you to say, maybe there's a way I can teach this a little better. Maybe let's take a fresh look at this and how I might do a better job of conveying this. Maybe I can do it not quicker for the sake of speed, but how can I do this better so that when I get done showing this, 8 out of 10 of my students are going, yeah, I can start getting to this instead of 3 or 2 or, maybe none. I've seen Shihans at seminars struggle with an entire room full, and they can't get anybody to pick up on what they're dishing out. And of course, what I've seen of traditional Japanese culture is that's always the student's fault. That's never the instructor's fault. In my opinion, that is incorrect. If you have a body of students, and I don't care if you got 3 of them or 30 of them or 300, if you're showing material and nobody's picking up on it, that's not the student's fault. That responsibility falls on us, the instructor. And that's an invitation to improve. So I want to wrap it up here. Like I said, my intent here is not to throw stones for the sake of throwing stones. I want to throw stones for the sake of trying to improve what we have and trying to reclaim respect that this art had at one point. And I feel that that's very important to me. I've had many thoughts of giving up on it and going on to something different, not staying with the Aikido term or name. But something in my heart tells me don't give up on it. It's not beyond redemption. And there are very good people in it that have stuck with it and feel the same way I do. And unfortunately, there have been people that feel the way I do that have walked away from it, and they gave up on it because it just was not martial. It wasn't sufficient. And I think that I would love to see those people back. I'd love to see those people say, because they've all admitted they love Aikido. They loved it when they started it, and they even loved it when they had to quit and leave because it just wasn't doing it. And they still love it after they left. They love the idea of it. And I think that love is what will build the art back up. So thank you very much for listening to this entire podcast. I do appreciate it. We got kind of a busy fall, but I'm going to still keep coming back with more episodes. I'm not sure if sometime there'll be a gap between them or not. I still love doing the interviews. I'm lining up with people to have some good chats with, and I know you guys enjoy those, but until next time, enjoy your training.